Today on Moment of Zen, we're bringing back a conversation I had with Samo Burja, exploring the thesis that human civilization is much older than previously believed and examines why civilizations rise and fall. This originally aired on Samo's show Live Players in 2023. Let's dive in.
We're here today to talk about long history. Samo, what is long history and what got you excited about it? Why don't we give some background and then let's get into it?
Long history is actually a term I coined, which describes this idea that human history has been far longer than previously believed. The normal way that scholars talk about the term history is that history is the same as recorded history, and prehistory is what we have with all of these vastly different archaeological finds, everything from stone tools to bones to, campfire sites, cave paintings, etc. I think in popular imagination, though, history is, civilization, cities, armies, rulers, religions, monuments, pyramids, etc. And prehistory is basically people, living in caves, covered in animal hides. The basic thesis of long history, as I coined it, is that our civilized history, that is the history of complex society, is much, much older than previously believed. The normal view, the consensus view of human history for the last few decades has been that as the previous ice age ended, we had a long period of climactic stability, which was followed by agriculture, which was then followed by complex societies. However, there have been a number of very exciting finds, including Göbekli Tepe in eastern Turkey, that I think push this into a much earlier history, and we can get into why.
Let's do that. Talk about what are the finds and what do they mean?
Well, basically, I wrote this article for Palladium magazine. Now it's been actually a few years ago already. It was published in 2021, and in it I just dove very, very deeply into the archaeological literature. So I, warmly recommend listeners just read that article. But Göbekli Tepe is an 11,500-year-old site in southeastern Turkey, where you have basically monumental scale construction, hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years, before the earliest evidence of agriculture. So why is 11,500 such an important dateline? Well, first off, it's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. And this monumental construction that's on top of this hill, Tepe basically means a hill in Turkish. So actually a lot of these sites, if you hear about them from Turkey or even further from places like Kazakhstan and so on, they'll have a Tepe at the end of the site, right? Because it's on top of a hill. So on top of this hill, 6,000 years before Stonehenge in Britain, you have a circle of tall T-shaped pillars weighing many, many tons with carved images of animals, also carved images of people. Nearby sites even have statues of people. The site was in use for hundreds of years. It was only correctly dated after 1994. There's an interesting point to be made about archaeologists finding what they expect to find, since the site was first excavated in the 1960s, I think by a team from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul. And they found these Neolithic, that is Stone Age tools, and they correctly dated the tools, but they assumed the larger construction, the larger monuments, that all of that must have been built later. They actually mistook it for a medieval cemetery. It took until 1994 for the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt to take a closer look at it with a new Turkish team. He was convinced that the site was much older because he had seen similar sites that were much more conventional, by a few thousand years younger, in the same region. And then they managed to get a radiocarbon date on some deposits, and it was 11,500 years old. This puts it basically exactly at the end of the last ice age. That means there's no long period of climactic stability followed by agriculture, followed by building cities or monuments. People are building monuments right at the very end of the Ice Age. And you know what? We are very, very unlikely to find the oldest evidence of anything whatsoever. In fact, I would say that the earlier you go in history, right, the less likely you are to find something that is the oldest example. If our civilization was to completely collapse, future archaeologists would be lucky to find a few thousand preserved cars, even though, of course, we make millions, right? You're very unlikely to discover any given thing, let alone the oldest example of something. So the fact that we have a fairly developed structure with honestly advanced architecture, something that took hundreds of people to build, that its dating is undisputed, that is in the region where we know civilization, it was one of the origin centers of civilization. So these are the hills not too far from the source of the Tigris and Euphrates River. All of that to me just says that, yeah, people were probably building monuments like this throughout the Ice Age. And there are actually many exciting archaeological sites that are now being investigated in that same region, in the Şanlıurfa area in southeast Turkey, right? The nearest city is just very near the Syrian border. And unlike Syria, I think Turkey is stable enough to allow for such digs. But I'm pretty sure that if we dug in Syria and Iraq, in northern Iraq and in northern Syria, specifically looking for sites that are 11,000 years old, rather than, the sort of Sumerian and Babylonian stuff that we normally might try to find in those regions, I'm pretty sure we would find many more sites like this. I don't think this was an exceptional site. I think it is a remarkable site today, but it wasn't exceptional at the time. I think we dug up what was probably the equivalent of a cathedral of this ancient complex society, and I don't think it was the only cathedral.
Is this damning for other sort of archaeologists or historians, or how have people responded to this thesis, or how might they respond, or what does it threaten, if anything?
Well, what's very important to know is that consensus moves very slowly in academic circles. So it is something that has been debated and disputed for the last 10 to 20 years. And it has taken since 1994 for the consensus to even settle on the appropriate dating, let alone any sort of revision of general theories. I think for the most part, people are sticking to the old theory of post-agricultural accumulation as the origin of civilization. And they have not yet begun looking at many other hypotheses. Klaus himself, before he, I think, passed away in the early 2000s, advocated for a theory where perhaps religion came first and agriculture came after religion, so that these hunter-gatherers would organize into complex religion, build these temple sites, etc., and then in order to feed the workforce, they would pick up agriculture. That's like the most interesting deviation that they've really proposed on the basis of this and other finds in the region. I do think they are hesitant to do a more radical revision because there are no career benefits to being the one archaeologist with a crazy theory. Digs are expensive, right? They take both skilled labor and unskilled labor. So when you're using unskilled labor, basically having people move dirt, because if you try to use heavy machinery, you're going to damage stuff. They might steal stuff too. This is a known and endemic problem in Egyptology where, things might be found and might actually be stolen and hit the black market. It was also a problem in Iraq, for example, right? When the invasion happened in 2004, the Antiquities Museum was looted. And it didn't have like golden pharaonic masks, or not, at least not too many of them. It just had these small stone statues and clay tablets, etc. But these still make a decent amount on the antiquities market, which is a great trade, a great international trade in these sort of illegal antiquities that goes into the hands of private collectors all around the world. Like, honestly, it is its own kind of peculiar flex to say, have something and, you know, display it in your living room. And it's like 9,000 years old or whatever. It's a flex, right? But it's also one of the drivers of entropy for the stuff that is fine, for the rare things that do survive. So that means you need to have security at your archaeological site. And skilled labor, well, you need to correctly date things. You need to know how to collect samples, how to document stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no way around it. It's a labor-intense process all around. And this means you are always struggling for funding. And universities and most other bureaucratic organizations will only fund stuff that looks very normal. And archaeologists, at the end of the day, are not in the business of hypothesizing what human nature is, or what human civilization is, or what big picture history is. Their job, in a way, is to just dig up and accurately document and accurately interpret sites. And that in itself is different. It means that they're very empirical driven. So even if their old hypothesis that explained, you know, the origin of civilization and so on is overturned, they struggle to find alternative. You know, there's no career reward for proposing bold ideas of totally new places to dig. It's very reactive. You chance upon a site, you find a site, right? You don't go and seek out a site. There was a whole different generation of archaeology that did do this in the late 19th century, when it was almost kind of like an adventure discipline, with people setting out on their own funds or on raised funds to dig up Troy, which is what Schliemann did. And, you know, today archaeologists, you know, they don't like him because, for example, at some parts of the excavation, he would even use dynamite to remove dirt. But, you know, at the time, dynamite was high tech. I think a modern Schliemann would be much less objectionable, since I think that if you could convince, you know, an eccentric tech billionaire, you know, that you can always have, some of them pick up the best hobbies, right? Like immortality or whatever. Brian Johnson is a great example. If someone picked this up today and decided to be a modern day Schliemann, I honestly think there are amazing things that could be done with the use of drones in archaeology, because there's already been such progress. So really, I think that a totally new funding model is needed before we could really undertake hypothesis-driven archaeology. So instead of reactive archaeology, where we dig something and we say, this is the oldest X found so far, and I'm not going to speculate how old they might be, and I'm not going to speculate where else to dig. We could go into hypothesis-driven archaeology and or a history hypothesis informed archaeology, a longer history, and we could fund hypothesis digs, where you just fund a dig at an extremely promising site with the intent to try to see, could we find something there? Can we find a lost city? And by the way, there are many, many lost cities just in the, you know, period of 3000 BC where we don't know where they could be, and they continue to be found. Right, the Hittite capital of Hattusa is still being dug up. And in the middle of the 19th century, people had no idea that the Hittites even existed. For every single decade of the last 150 years, we have discovered a new several thousand-year-old civilization somewhere around the world. Like, I can give examples, like in the 1970s, near the Oxus River in Central Asia, they discovered the Oxus civilization, which is, you know, its own distinct, though not very well known, settled agricultural society with truly remarkable art and large walled cities. Actually, one of the cities has a grid layout, which is just shocking, right? That's not something you would expect 5,000 years ago, making it contemporary of the more well-known Sumerians and Babylonians later, and also the Indus Valley civilization.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. It's a bull market. It's a bear market. Rates will rise or fall. Can someone invent a crystal ball? Until then, over 41,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. When you're closing the books in days and not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If I had needed this product, it's what I'd use. Whether your company is earning millions or even hundreds of millions, Netsuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/zen. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/zen. netsuite.com/zen. The origins of this podcast were once just a dream. That dream turned into the podcast and business you are listening to today. Taking your business to the next level is a dream lots of us share, but too often it remains just a dream. We hold ourselves back thinking, what if I don't have the skills? What if I can't do it alone? Turn those what ifs into why nots and help your business soar with Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. What if I don't have a big team? Shopify helps you handle anything, from website design to managing inventory to customer service to global shipping and more, all in one place. Marketing budget next to nil? Shopify's built-in marketing and email tools help you find new customers and keep them. What if I'm looking to grow my business in person? Shopify's award-winning point of sale connects your online and offline sales in the same place. Keen to start selling globally? Shopify helps you sell in over 150 countries, tackling everything from translations to global shipping. What if I need to boost sales? With 99.99% uptime and the best converting checkout on the planet, you'll never miss a sale again, only with Shopify. Turn those what ifs into why nots and keep giving those big dreams the best shot with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/momentofzen. Go to shopify.com/momentofzen. Shopify.com/momentofzen.
Nat Friedman is doing his own sort of archaeology project, sort of just to give an example of independent people who are producing archaeology searches and putting up money for them. So maybe we'll see more. I mean, as a segue from that, like, why does it matter in the sense of say more about some of the implications of if what you say in your article is correct in terms of our new understanding of this history archaeology or even your hypotheses about what else we could discover? What assumptions rest upon our current understanding of history archaeology that would be challenged, and thus would we have a different, like what different views might we have about society as a result? Like, what are some of the ways in which it matters or makes a difference, you feel, beyond sort of the trivia of it?
Nat Friedman's project, by the way, is amazing because it extends the narrow definition of history. If successful, it will recover new, previously unreadable texts from the libraries preserved by the volcanic ash at Heracleum. The scrolls are far too fragile to be unrolled, but if you scan them and you use software to reconstruct the texts, we might recover completely lost Greek plays, scientific papers, histories and legal texts in Latin. And, honestly, I think we underestimate still even classical antiquity. Consider for a moment that Archimedes was using essentially a form of calculus to calculate water displacement for a boat, and that Heron was building prototype steam engines. What else have we forgotten about that era of 300 BC to 200 AD, when one could argue Western civilization first emerged and only to then fall and be transformed? And that brings me to the first implication of a much longer history. I think we have seen many cycles of civilizations rise and fall. I don't think history is a ratchet or a simple upwards curve. I think it has periods where we have compounding and accelerating returns. We have rapid technological, economic, social, scientific advancement. And then for reasons we do not yet understand, all past civilizations, not yet counting our own, have undergone stagnant periods. A great example of this would be medieval China, where for many centuries, the standard of living not only was higher than in Europe, but was improving at a faster rate than in Europe. And you would see amazing things like in 12th century China, you would have clock towers, right? So public timekeeping using mechanical clocks, right? And you would also see stuff like outwardly expanding trade networks in Southeast Asia. Actually, some of the overseas Chinese minorities in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and so on, they actually trace their roots hundreds of years ago to some of these rare Chinese dynasties that were interested in overseas trade rather than isolationist. Regardless, that point leads to a very different view of our own future. Maybe we're on the cusp of the singularity. Maybe our friends at OpenAI or DeepMind or Anthropic are going to break human history and rupture into a new era, perhaps a deeply post-human era. Or maybe Western civilization is not an exception. And today, one could even argue that a place like China is part of Western civilization. After all, they adopted the modern nation state from the European model. They adopted Marxism from the Russian and German model. They're adopting Silicon Valley-style startups from the American model. It's hard to find something that's not truly Western about it. Even the totalitarian side, right? Like the party state is a Soviet and European innovation in political science in the and early 20th century. We might not like it, but it's hardly the same thing as what some historians called Oriental despotism of a large imperial bureaucracy centuries ago. I think, Xi is more a Western-style dictator than he is a Chinese emperor. And I think in the big picture version of history, that really matters, right? It reminds me of how some of the states in and around the Roman Empire actually looked awfully Roman, even if not conquered by the Romans themselves, just because there was such an efficient military, economic, and cultural package, and elites always want to imitate the most prestigious thing around. So yeah, imagine that history is hundreds of thousands of years old, with many civilizations rising and falling, where things like the Bronze Age collapse 1000 BC and the fall of the Roman Empire or the end of the Han Dynasty, these are just normal occurrences, right? And long periods of stagnation, like hundreds or thousands of years of little economic growth in the Nile River Delta, are also normal. And just because we have industrial society doesn't mean we have escaped this cycle. I think that's a deeply uncomfortable thought. And I think its implications are that we might actually have a far longer future ahead of us than we think. When we look at the future, we imagine infinite compounding growth, which means that we hit the singularity either in 6 months, right? This exponential of extreme acceleration and returns. We either hit it in like 6 months or 6 years or 60 years or 600 years, but it's definitely us that reaches it. And I'm like, well, at any point, we might yet see a cessation of this. And then we might see a long period of stagnancy, and then our civilization might fall. And then, the singularity hypothesis might still be true, but it could be that, 1,000 years from now, people are going to talk about the lost civilization of the USAians and how they had large language models that were rudimentary AI. But really, it's interesting why they didn't apply those models to solve their problems and save themselves. And they might wonder in the same way we wonder about Heron's steam engine and the Roman Empire, why that didn't cause an industrial revolution, right, as we would understand it.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js, ready to onboard to your team today. For back-end, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork, billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
So what have we learned about why civilizations do rise and fall? What are the common patterns or trends? I know you've done a lot of work into this, but if it's more common, what can we think? Perhaps what can we appreciate about or understand about why it happens?
Well, I think one of the more interesting points is that there are generally two sorts of large phenomena that affect civilization on this macro scale. I think you can have a fairly centralized and dysfunctional government where there is a military hegemon that is militarily overextended, overtaxes, and essentially dominates its immediate area to the point that it starts immiserating it over a period of centuries, right? Roman society was poorer in the 4th century AD, before the fall of the Roman Empire, than it was in the 2nd century AD. That leaves it eventually fragile, and eventually it becomes incapable of either fielding armies or continuing, fulfilling fiscal needs. That can lead to a total military collapse or military exhaustion. If I were to be somewhat playful, I would say that perhaps the collapse of the Soviet Union is a classical example of this, where you have a large Eurasian military empire engaged in an arms race. The arms race becomes unaffordable, produces a political crisis, and then eventually there's political dissolution. So even though there are no invading barbarians in that model, the hegemony is broken because it's economically unsustainable. So that'll be pattern number one. And then I think pattern number two that I would point to is the collapse of complex trade networks, where you might have a relatively complex technological system and interdependency between several societies. And then, there might be a flood, a famine, a volcanic eruption, a barbarian invasion here or there. But usually the trade system of several societies has enough resilience that any one trade partner can be replaced. But if too many shocks hit the system, you might have a vicious cycle where diseconomies of scale hit very rapidly. The Bronze Age collapse around 1000 BC in the Eastern Mediterranean saw societies as diverse as the Mycenaeans, Minoans, Assyrians, various Canaanite cities, the Egyptians, all undergo a simultaneous crisis. Why? Bronze Age society was deeply dependent on long distance, one could even say with most recent evidence, intercontinental trade, right? In fact, there's evidence that tin was shipped into places like modern-day Cyprus and Turkey from as far away as Afghanistan and Britain. There's also evidence even of trade of bronze for various amber artifacts and so on, up to northern Scandinavia. I'm sure there are yet undiscovered trade routes that went into West Africa and East Africa, and I'm sure also into Central Siberia. The archaeology of this long-distance trade suffers from the same problems that you might have with the archaeology of monumental sites, except it's even more difficult, right? Anything you bother trading long distance is valuable. Anything that is valuable, even if lost, people will try to recover it. So this is why shipwrecks are an important source of information for trade in history. And that means that it's unlikely, to stay buried in that sense. It's very much likely to be reused, melted down, etc. So copper, for a variety of reasons, tends to not be found in the same deposits as tin. And you need to mix copper and tin for bronze. So the whole international economy of the ancient world was arguably based on providing copper and tin to the places that consumed and needed the most bronze, both for their tools and for their weapons. Societies like Egypt, societies like early Assyria, societies like the Babylonians, and so on. Disrupt that trade, and the society collapses. Some people have proposed that a sufficiently serious war between the United States and China might destroy most of the world's chip fabs, and it could take decades to recuperate, right? I'm not sure how much of a collapse this would be economically, but were it to happen, that would be a mild example of lots and lots of technological dependencies breaking because international trade was disrupted, and this extreme specialization where every single society that fails sort of produces more cascading failures through the system. So a kind of rapid impoverishment.
We mentioned earlier in our last episode that Henry Kissinger was a student of history. There are people in government and foreign policy who are deeper historians than others. For the people who really don't have an understanding of any of these sort of civilizations that you mentioned, what do you think they're missing out, or it causes them to understand differently or act differently as a result?
I think it's a check on human hubris. Every time in history we've said this time is different, and we are always somewhat correct and somewhat wrong. I think that one of the deepest and most interesting things one can learn by looking at ancient societies, in addition to the check in hubris, is this view of what is human nature and what do humans respond to, and what even is, for example, religion? What is commerce? What is a government? There's interesting archaeological finds for giant breweries in ancient Egypt owned by the pharaoh. And then you realize, wait, the production of alcohol and the enforcement of a royal monopoly was probably a significant source of revenue. And then you realize, wait, taxation can occur in a number of different ways. And that's when you start to realize that, things like inflation or things like state-owned companies can also be a form of taxation, even if they don't go from your paycheck, right? They're a form of extraction from society. So you could get that same insight just thinking through economics, but I think there's something very provocative and creative about comparing these things. Or, for example, there is this interesting limit to the, how secular can a society truly be? I've often been playful and said that even modern states, such as the United States, are often, very much beholden to a kind of civic religion and mythos. In a previous episode, I mentioned the nuclear football, right? Like the president's nuclear football opens it, presses the button, the world is over. Any other society, if we read this story about their ruler, we would classify that as a religious myth. In our society, we just take it to be true. Like, I could be provocative even and say, we don't know it's true. We actually never tested launching thousands of ICBMs. Like, we've tested the nukes, we've tested the rockets. Testing the full ICBM system has actually not been done very much, especially after the weapons ban. So we don't even know if the doomsday machine works. I don't think we should test the full doomsday machine. But again, archaeologists 1,000 years from now might look at our ICBMs and say, our computer and AI simulations show these things would have worked at a 10 to 20% rate. These guys were just cargo culting more advanced technology than what they had. These are like Easter Island statues, and they spent so much of their resources, both the American culture and the Soviet civilization that collapsed 50 years before the American one collapsed. They both, really overinvested into the semi-fictional technology. I don't think that's likeliest to be the case, but I would put like 5 to 10% that that's how the future will see us. So we have a civic mythology too. We have rituals, we have scapegoating, right? The president is responsible for the economy, whether or not he does something about the economy. It's very interesting. It's, maybe the economy is under, at least for some presidents, the economy is more like weather than their company, right? They have very few actuators to shape the economy, right? Yet we still all hold them accountable. It's one of the strongest things in presidential polls. So yeah, there is an element of deep mythos there. And, a lot of startups play with on the thin border between profit making and myth making. And the two are very intimately connected because of branding and also because of talent acquisition.
So when we deeply understand ancient history, it's interesting to think about where are areas where we take lessons and say, hey, we're like people back then, and where are areas where we say, hey, actually, we've evolved in some way, either culturally or even biologically, and we shouldn't over rotate on lessons from the past, because there are lots of things that people in history have been doing for a very long time that worked, that we don't do today, or that we do differently today, and maybe that sometimes it's a lesson that, hey, maybe there's we should have more sympathy for those, or be more open to ways people have acted in the past, or other times it's we say, hey, actually, the way they did it wasn't the best way to do it, and we have figured out something new. Although that seems like a high bar to have that perspective. I'm curious how you think about making sure not to over rotate, or when to not listen to history.
I think, we shouldn't use history just as a negative example. I think that's its own fallacy, because there's a massive diversity of ancient civilizations, truly very different societies and different economic models, different religious models, political models. I think the full range of human behavior remains to be explored. If we had 1,000 planets or 1 billion years of history, then maybe we would have a true understanding of the limits of what humans can do. I don't think we're near those limits yet. I would view history more as a positive example, in the sense that, look, this society was static for 1,000 years, and then they did something new and something amazing. Or, wow, this is not possible in our society. How did they do it, right? You have these remarkable feats of coordination and achievement with much more primitive technology, with much less wealth, that we struggle to consider how we could do today. Consider how competent the US government was in the execution of the Manhattan Project. If there was a need for a Manhattan Project today, I don't think we would be as good at it. We would probably spend much more on a comparable project. And that means that there is something in terms of either civic citizens' virtue, or in the structure of a much smaller, leaner, more talent-driven, more meritocracy-driven bureaucracy, that we've forgotten as a social technology, right? I think thinking of societies in history as, each civilization having like 5 to 20 social technologies, that is, unique social practices that allow them to organize humans in new and interesting ways, I think that's very fruitful. The Roman concept of law, and the Anglo-Saxon concept of law, and the Islamic concept of law, and the Chinese one, well, they're all law, but they have really different principles behind them. And, we could write some fun science fiction and be like, well, a universe where startup cultures first started in Riyadh, and all startup equity is constrained by Sharia law, and, there are various limits on when you can go into debt or not. And this caused this kind of technology to be pursued rather than a different one, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it might sound funny, but it is really deeply true that how humans organize themselves produces very different externalities. I talked earlier about, the negative externalities of military overextension, right? There are positives to military overextension too. For example, large-scale military overextension, depending on the tax system, can result in a flourishing of trade. No one ever accused the Mongols of being gentle, and they certainly destroyed many, many Central Asian civilizations that honestly were settled peoples, right? Even today, Kazakhstan is a low population density country. Possibly the population is no bigger there than it was before the Mongol invasion, where we have evidence of all these cities. And in China, they weren't so destructive. But either way, having a single military ruler and their authority not being based on religion made religious pluralism possible. And secondly, them not being a settled bureaucratic elite meant that their taxation of the trade routes was very light. So the Silk Road flourished under the Mongols, because at the end of the day, they would just use their very mobile forces to keep trade routes open, overland caravan routes open, and they would take a fairly light tax once the conquering was done, right? And these structural differences matter immensely. And today, I think we are still observing the play out of differences in social technology between, say, the United States and China, even though, as I say, I think, China, let's put it this way, China and the US in the big picture of history are 80 to 90% similar societies. And I think that might be also a provocative thing to say.
Say more about that, or just because it doesn't feel intuitive. So how so?
Well, for starters, do they both have the position of a CEO? How are companies run? Do both have boards overseeing the CEO? Do both have, an FDA or an FDA equivalent? Do they have food quality controls? Do they have a Navy, Air Force, and an Army? What are the ranks used in those? How similar or dissimilar is the chain of command? How do they do weapons procurement? Do they have defense contractors? What is a defense contractor? Right? It's a private organization making arms for the state. It's not the state itself making arms. Do they have software startups? Do they have an interoperable enough business culture that you can have American IP built in Chinese factories? Do they debate socialism versus capitalism? Yes. Which sources do they cite? Actually, they cite a lot of the same sources when debating, even domestically within China. They'll cite Western economists, right? In America, we don't yet cite Chinese economists, but again, 80 to 90% of the core economic theory is actually the same. We're just disagreeing about the last 10 or 20%. Even the arguments that say, it gets very subtle. For example, even the view of the role of the press, right? Where America has freedom of speech. In China, they would even say that they have their own version of freedom of speech in a more limited sense. It doesn't quite exist the way we would think of it, but they would point to a few things that can be said that couldn't be said in the past, right? And they would perceive themselves also in a way as a democratic society. It's just that they would say that, our representative system is different than your representative system. It's not like the people are in charge in the United States either. You guys vote for members of one or two parties. We vote for members of one party. Is that really that big a difference? Right? There are elections held in China at various levels, right? So again, you could say that America has a functional democracy and China has some vestigial elements of people's authority. But they pay lip service to those. Domestically, they pay lip service to those. They grant legitimacy. So wait, actually, 80 to 90% of the sources of political legitimacy and authority are the same. The Chinese Communist Party should rule because it's delivering on the Chinese dream, because young Chinese are living better than older Chinese. They're both becoming large middle-class societies. People focus on the Chinese bullet trains between the big cities, but I would rather point to the car sales. It is now typical in China to have a car. That's a world of difference from 30 years ago. So I think the fact that they both are becoming car-oriented commuter cultures, right? This introduces this strange distinction between where you live and where you work. We can continue listing these similarities, and none of them, I think, are actually set in stone. All of them could be organized differently, perhaps not as efficiently. But there truly is a deep similarity there. Consider reading or watching interviews with Chinese entrepreneurs. Literally, the founder of TikTok cites the lean startup. They are part of an offshoot of American Silicon Valley culture. It's because a lot of them studied in the United States. There was just this period where a lot of the people that studied returned. I've heard in the most recent numbers that has stopped, that was a pre-Xi phenomena. But that pre-Xi phenomena was enough for so many giants, DJI and so on. It's remarkable. These are really good tech companies, and they're run within the political constraints of the Chinese system, much as an American one would be. The main difference is that when Jack Ma got uppity, he sort of disappeared for a while and then returned back in public very politely and very restrained. So let's say that the controls on uppity tech CEOs are harsher in China significantly. But the very fact that Jack Ma felt free in the first place to speak up on problems with the Chinese Communist Party, even from a purely technocratic level, not like we should abandon CCP rule, but like, oh yeah, this is run inefficiently, we should run this like a startup, et cetera, et cetera. All of these same critiques that we might have here in San Francisco of DC, right? He said a lot of the same critiques with Chinese characteristics, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's fascinating. I'm going to segue to something else, but that's related to sort of, where our conversation around civilizations falling. I was having dinner with a couple of effective altruists recently, and they were lamenting that EA had shifted from sort of, trying to solve malaria to trying to address sort of existential risk and just focus on long-termism. I'm curious what you think about that shift, but also I'm curious if you were the head of existential risk, or if you were, the one thinking about, hey, how do we prevent our civilization from falling? Where would you spend your time and money in terms of where do you think is the highest leverage point to focus?
Yeah, I think we need to diversify our portfolio, metaphorically and literally. I think that this has been a topic we've implicitly touched on in previous episodes. I think we're under-generating live players, and I would try to do anything at all possible to encourage and facilitate the creation of more people who have this unique drive that is not correlated to what the mainstream is doing. We should be less overinvested into the university system, because the university system is something that makes all high human capital shaped the same way. Everyone who goes through that process, through that network, is sort of a little bit converged to what the ideas of their era of academia are. I would also invest more into basically novel energy sources, and I would allow for more government experimentation within the Western world, right? It's sort of like, yeah, democracy is a great moral achievement, et cetera, but, it sure would be nice if we knew how to build a new city, right? Like maybe we need special economic zones. Maybe the EU needs special economic zones. Maybe we need corporate-run cities in addition to our democratically run cities. Maybe we need to actually back seasteading as a serious effort, because the US say, for example, we could say that US naval dominance is only assured for the next 40 to 50 years. And actually, it's in US interest to privatize the international seas and allow their settling and exploitation, because that's going to bolster and prolong the naval hegemony, and so on and so on. I think also military overextension is a significant problem for the US. The US is fabulously wealthy compared to most the rest of the world, but its economy is at this point roughly comparable to the size of China's economy. China is poorer per capita, but whatever measure you take, China is comparable, sometimes larger in, say, production, sometimes smaller in terms of various forms of capitalization. I don't think, when it comes to military overextension, it's always a relative game. It's never an absolute game. Meanwhile, wealth is an absolute game. So this sort of relative zero-sum thing can eat up even trillions of dollars, right? And can, of course, eat up also, which is much more important, hundreds of thousands of lives as well.
Well put. Talk about fertility for a second in terms of how big is that a risk, sort of, of population collapse? How big is that a risk of a dark age?
I think it is a real concern. And I will point out that past civilizations have undergone mysterious periods of low fertility as well. And it sure would be neat if we had an easy answer. For example, the liberal answer, let's say, was higher wealth transfers and social services to assist mothers in the workplace. And that was sort of tried in Sweden and so on. And it helps a little bit, but not enough to put fertility above 2.1. And then the socially conservative answers, like we need to find God, we need to be religious, we need to be more modest, we need to ban pornography. Like on the margin, maybe this helps. But again, East Asian society is far less feminist than we are. yet their fertility is even lower. And Iran, it's very, very fundamentalist. It has a religious police, yet somehow bearded guys harassing you in the streets to cover up. That seems to not increase Iranian fertility. Iran's fertility is 1.7 babies, even though it's like still a very poor country. Something is happening with regard to fertility. All of the mainstream theories are at least somewhat wrong. We don't know which policy interventions can raise fertility, at least raise it enough in a cost-effective enough way. We are about to fight a really nasty culture war over fertility. It's going to center on the feminism versus anti-feminism. I think both feminism and anti-feminism are actually a distraction, but try saying that as we inevitably become polarized over this and ideologically at a breaking point. And then finally, the worst problem our civilization might encounter is we might recast our own decline and failure as a success. Because we believe, and in fact probably do have, serious environmental problems like global warming, which could be solved, I think, with better technology and social organization, we might say, the world's population shrinking is a good thing. We're going to recover, and we're going to let nature recover. And this is going to make the far future even better. And we can just totally rationalize being slightly poorer every year as we get older every year and as we get smaller every year, to the point where the pressures are so intense. Like the political problem with an inverted age pyramid is that all the voters and many of the workers and many of the soldiers who are old outnumber the young, and they're all in favor of taxing the young. We previously talked about indirect forms of taxation that aren't income taxes, right? Like we talked about state-owned monopolies, we talked about, inflation and so on. The political pressure, most societies through human history have been like age pyramids where lots of young people, small number of old people. As a species, I think we have always been gerontocratic. That is, for structural and biological reasons, we always give power to the old, but that was counterbalanced with the majority of people being young. Now we are entering into societies that are columns or inverted age pyramids where most of the people are old. It might seem on paper like, the old retire and don't work. Therefore, the salaries and compensation of the young rises. And while the young are taxed, to provide for the old, the taxation doesn't increase more than their wages do. But I think that's incorrect, especially because you can have, we talk about Zoomers and millennials doing quiet quitting during and after COVID. I think boomers have been quiet quitting for a while. I think it's retire in place. We could call it like mise en place. We could be like retire en place, right? You are on the payroll. You're showing up to the office. You're not doing that much. Your intern is doing a lot. Your intern is actually doing 80% of your work, opening your emails, checking your PDFs, whatever, right? All the stuff that you don't even bother to learn. Who's really doing the work and who's being taxed? If we think of it not as purely, the IRS harassing you, but as extraction, I think the old are taxing the young. And if the old are taxing the young, and if we adopt as a civilization a misanthropic ideology where human life is bad and where we're bad for the planet and where fewer of us is good, by the way, that's great. Instead of saying we failed to raise fertility and our deficit is rising, you can say we've reduced carbon emissions this year by 5%. It's not that our tax base is smaller than 5%. We've reduced carbon emissions by 5% this year. We're the greenest country in the world. Right.
Let's wrap on that. This has been a fantastic conversation on long history, why civilizations fall, and learnings as it relates to preventing that today. Samo, pleasure as always, and until next time.
Until next time.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts, to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors.